After World War I, the Allies had forced Germany to sign the harsh Treaty of Versailles in 1919. It imposed enormous reparations, financial payments on Germany. It forbade Germany from having a significant army or navy, and it forced Germany to admit that it was the guilty party that had caused World War I. And most Germans deeply resented these terms, as did the German clergy. They were also deeply dismayed by the Republican government that was established in place of the old empire, especially the fact that in this Republican government, known as the Weimar Republic, socialist parties played a major role. When the Social Democrats sought to free education from the oversight of the churches and to eliminate state funding for the churches, pastors led the opposition against it. And during the following years, many Christians were disillusioned by what they perceived as the Republic's failures to execute its responsibilities to curb atheism, immorality, and pluralism, and its weakness in the face of socialism and communism. Many Germans were leaving the church in this period, disillusioned by it. Some 2.5 million Germans left the church in the years of the Weimar Republic between 1918 and 1931. And this soured pastors all the more to the trends going on in Germany. A growing number of pastors embraced the notion of race, or Volk, as a divine order established by God. The idea that God has established race as one of the natural orders of creation. And Protestant liberal theologians argued that God's revelation in nature and history, including through the German experience, was equally authoritative as Scripture. And they believed this revelation in nature and history clearly established the importance of race. Through the 1920s, as the German Republic prospered, radicalism was kept to the fringes. But everything changed when the Great Depression broke out in the 1930s and crushed the nation's economy. Extremist parties such as the Communists and the Nazi Party surged in the polls, while conservative Democratic and Social Democratic parties grew weaker. In 1932, a group of pastors and theologians formed the Deutsche Christen movement, or the German Christian movement. And this movement proclaimed the Volk as the great social, communitarian, and ethical principle demanding their allegiance. They called it the new ethical point of reference for theology. In other words, the church's task was to use its authority to promote the purification and health of the folk. This is one of the flags or the symbols of the Deutsche Christian movement, which you can see with the Nazi swastika superimposed on the Christian cross. Now, it's important to note that many Protestants dismissed the German Christian movement as heretical. They realized that this was not true Christianity. They rejected it just like they rejected other aspects of Protestant liberalism. Here's another image of how the Nazi ideology became so central in some German churches. But while most Christian Germans condemned the German Christian movement, even mainstream German clergy were influenced by rising anti-Semitism. In the past, of course, anti-Semitism had long been present in European history, but it had been religiously motivated. It had opposed Jews as a religious group, not Jews who became Christians. But this new kind of anti-Semitism focused very much on race. Also, many of these clergy were terrified by the rise of communism, and many pastors identified or associated Jews with secularism and communism. So one pastor described the threat he perceived from, quote, the secular a-religious Jew. He has followed the path of outrage against God to its final consequence. In his heart he has bid farewell to the last bits of faith and reverence before God. His ideal is the spirit of the French Revolution, the spirit of liberalism and materialism, Marxism, and Bolshevism, but also, when possible, the spirit of unprincipled mammonism and the unbridled greed of a Caesar-like world domination. He is everywhere where there is something to subvert, to destroy, whether it be marriage and family, love for the fatherland or the church, discipline and order, chastity and decency, wherever there is something to gain. An atheist is always destructive, but nowhere does the pernicious power of this attitude have such devastating effect as in the Jew, who has squandered his rich Old Testament legacy and gone among the swine." End quote. This shows you how anti-Semitism had been tied up with all the different aspects of the culture war that German pastors, many Christians in Germany, were afraid of, and how they associated the Jews with everything that seemed to them to be going wrong in the modern world. Now, as the Nazi Party grew to prominence, most Protestant clergy did not support it. But as many as 80% of them supported the Deutsche Nationale Volkspartei, or the DNVP, which was a conservative nationalist party, a little bit to the left of the Nazi Party, but still on the right. But they certainly viewed Hitler as preferable to communism. Although they rejected Hitler's harsher rhetoric, they welcomed his rise to power, viewing him as a tool in the hands of God to restore Germany to its moral, religious, cultural, and military greatness. And of course, they didn't know what Hitler was going to do in terms of world conquest or in terms of killing all the Jews. And Hitler had been downplaying his anti-Semitism in elite circles. He had been speaking in religious language that resonated with Protestants. In fact, the Nazi Party platform promised religious liberty and support for what it called positive Christianity. And so when the Nazis rose to power via election, democratically, the Catholic Bishop of Bavaria, Hans Meiser, issued a statement to be read from pulpits in Bavaria on Easter 1933, in which he applauded what was happening. He said, "A state which brings into being again government according to God's laws should, in doing so, be assured not only of the applause, but also of the glad and active cooperation of the Church. With gratitude and joy, the Church takes note that the new state bans blasphemy, assails immorality, and establishes discipline and order with a strong hand, while at the same time calling upon man to fear God, espousing the sanctity of marriage and Christian training for the young, bringing into honor again the deeds of our fathers, and kindling in thousands of hearts, in place of disparagement, an ardent love of Volk and fatherland." So there's this celebration of the Nazis as sort of reestablishing Christian Germany, so to speak. And this sense of national and religious renewal seemed to be confirmed by the sudden reversal of the trend toward decreasing church membership. So whereas in 1932, church membership dropped by 165,000 in Germany, in 1933, the year Hitler came to power, church membership actually rose by 267,000. And many clergy saw the church's task as not being to oppose anti-Semitism, but to ensure that anti-Semitism was expressed in a Christian manner, not emotional and hateful, but lawful and orderly. This idea that a certain kind of anti-Semitism is good because God created race and he wants life to be organized according to different races. Think of this in the same way that many Americans thought of the segregation of whites and blacks as God's will for society. And so as Christian Germans saw it, many of them, we just need to make sure that this is done in a fair and just way. Now, many began to wake up when they realized that the Deutsche Christen movement, the German Christian movement, intended to take full control of the church and make the church into an expression of Nazism. A Nazi was appointed as the Reichsbishop over all the churches. And Deutsche Christians edited Jewish influence out of the Bible and claimed that Jesus was Aryan, not Jewish. They sought to force the church to adopt what they called the Arian paragraph, which was being applied throughout German society, removing Jews from prominent positions. The matter was debated at a church synod. One group of theologians argued that the Arian paragraph, trying to exclude Jews, was a denial of the gospel, because the gospel says there's no difference between Jews and Gentiles. But another group argued that while Jews should not be excluded from the church, it was appropriate to exclude them from the clergy. Two pastors, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose prayer I read earlier, and Martin Niemöller, organized the Pastors' Emergency League, or PEL, to rally opposition to the Deutsche Christen movement. They prevented the synod from forcing the Arian paragraph on the church. But it was still applied in churches where the Deutsche Christians were actually in control. So they prevent it from being forced on all the churches, but some of the churches do it voluntarily. And Bonhoeffer became convinced that at this point, the German church was no longer a true church. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. By 1934, almost 40% of the Protestant clergy in Germany were members of Bonhoeffer's organization, the PEL. And so Hitler realized that he was losing what is known as the German church struggle, and he abandoned the campaign of the Deutsche Christians to force Nazism on the church. And interestingly, it was at this point that Hitler began to stress a separation of church and state. And Nazi leaders privately emphasized the incompatibility between Nazism and Christianity. And in the end, the Arian paragraph was never fully enforced against the church. In 1934, supporters of the PEL and the bishops of 3 intact regional churches, so these are regional churches that the Nazis did not control, gathered to establish what they called the Confessing Church. The Confessing Church adopted the Barmen Declaration. The Confessing Church remained within the church structures that already existed, but they were a body of pastors who were committed to the truths of the Barmen Declaration, written by Karl Barth and others. And basically, as you read when you read the Barmen Declaration, basically, the heart of it was a protest of the Nazi attempt to take over the church. You'll notice the declaration doesn't focus on anti-Semitism. It's not designed to sort of speak out in favor of the Jews. Rather, it's calling the church to fidelity to the one gospel revealed in Jesus Christ for all people. But it doesn't mention the Arian paragraph, let alone anti-Semitism. So it's a significant statement in that it denounced the Nazi attempt to take over the church, and it pledged allegiance to Jesus. But it fell far short when it came to witnessing against racism. Part of the problem was that many, even in the Confessing Church, including Bonhoeffer's partner Niemöller, supported the Nazi regime. Although they believed the state had no right to force the Arian paragraph on the church, some of them argued that the church should adopt it voluntarily. When Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations, the PEL, this organization Bonhoeffer started, actually endorsed the decision. And when the official church called pastors to swear an oath of allegiance to Hitler, most confessing pastors did so. Nevertheless, by 1935, the confessing church was facing persecution. Over 700 pastors had been arrested by 1937. Nevertheless, the confessing church continued to reject the Nazi demand to purge Jews from the church. Over the course of the 1930s, the Nazis gradually segregated the Jews from German society. Despite the efforts of Bonhoeffer and others, the confessing church refused to take a public stand against these policies. As I've already mentioned, many confessing church pastors supported what they considered a legitimate Christian anti-Semitism within biblical limits. The confessing church's provisional administration declared that, quote, according to the doctrine of the evangelical church, the natural bonds of race, Volkstum, homeland, and history should be respected and nurtured as a gift from God the Creator, and that such racial doctrine should be taught to children in the schools.